Hello everyone, I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Come, be still. The world is so loud, isn't it? Let me tell you about silence and the price of seeking it. The silence was always a temporary gift. I came to this place, this little annex 3 months ago. The rent was a soft whisper in a city that usually shouts. And the landlord, he had a nervous flutter in his eye when he spoke of the building's character. My apartment slept on the shoulders of what was once Kellerman's Forge, a place from the 1890s, a place of fire and steel. The woman who gave me the keys spoke of history as if it were a charming feature, a justification for the floors that sighed under my weight and the windows that never quite sealed their lips against the night. She did not mention the noise. It began in the first week, always when the quiet was most precious to me. I am a technical writer. I build quiet little houses of words, user manuals and software guides, work that requires a stillness of mind, a focus that shatters like glass the moment you suspect you are not alone in the room. The first time, I thought it was the city breathing, a construction project somewhere nearby. 3 slow, measured heartbeats of metal on metal, rising through the floorboards, a vibration I could feel in the hollow of my chest. Then, a silence that lasted 20 minutes. Then, 5 quick, light taps, followed by 2 deep, resonant pounds. I went downstairs. The old forge was a tomb now, a storage space for the landlord's trade in forgotten things. Towers of furniture slept under white sheets like patient ghosts. In the center of the room, the great anvil stood, its face scarred with a century of secrets. But no one had touched it. A soft, gray blanket of dust was proof of its long slumber. I went back upstairs, and the moment my hands found their rhythm on the keys, the hammering began again. By the 3rd week, I understood. The sounds were not random. They were a language. They followed a grammar of their own, deliberate and complex. 3 short strikes, a breath. 2 long ones, another breath. And then a single, sharp crack that seemed to split the air. Sometimes the phrases would repeat. Sometimes they would grow. A conversation where I was the only listener. A lesson in a language I did not wish to learn. I spoke to the landlord, a Mr. Kellerman, the great-grandson of the man who had first woken the forge. His left eye began to dance when I spoke of the noise. Old buildings, he said, his own gaze drifting away from mine. They settle, especially a place with this much history. The way his voice caught on that last word stayed with me. Have other tenants mentioned it? I asked. His laugh was a choked, wounded sound. You're the first one to stay longer than 6 weeks in 20 years. I should have left then. I should have gathered my quiet work and my few things and found a place with paper-thin walls and loud, living neighbors. Any place where the silence did not feel like a held breath. Instead, I began to listen. I became a student of the patterns. I bought a notebook. I wrote them down. Timestamps, durations, the texture of each sound. The hammering had a logic that I could feel, just beneath the surface of my understanding. A word on the tip of the tongue. The day I answered, the air was thick with unspoken frustration. I was trying to finish a manual, to build a perfect, logical house of words. The hammering had been a constant, frantic symphony for an hour, rising to a great crescendo, then starting again from the beginning. as if I had failed a test. In a moment of madness, or perhaps clarity, I took a hammer from my own toolbox. I struck the floor 3 times, my rhythm a perfect echo of the last phrase I had heard. The silence that followed was different. It was not an empty silence. It was an attentive silence. Then from below, a new pattern. Slow, deliberate. 4 strikes, each one separated by exactly 3 seconds of quiet. I wrote it down in my notebook, my hand trembling. It was the first exchange in a conversation I knew I should not be having. But I continued. The patterns grew. What began as a simple call and response became a form of instruction. The presence below, I no longer pretended it was the house settling, would offer a sequence and wait for me to repeat it. Then it would provide a new one, a variation, a correction. It was teaching me. It was teaching me to forge something. The understanding did not come in a flash. It seeped in slowly, over weeks of listening and transcribing, until the purpose of my lessons became horribly clear. I was learning to make a key, not a key of iron or steel, a key that could unlock silence itself. The patterns were the blueprint for an object that would exist in the space between sounds, a thing forged from pure intention. My notebook filled with impossible shapes, with geometries that made my eyes ache, with measurements that seemed to shimmer and change on the page. The lessons were no longer just about rhythm, but about the weight of the strike, the duration of the silence, the angle of the blow. Each detail was a word in the grammar of its creation. The night I forged the key, the building held its breath. The air was thick with the taste of old metal. The shadows were deeper. I worked for 3 hours, my hammer a percussive voice in the midnight quiet. I followed the patterns from my notebook, my body moving through sequences that felt both ancient and new. And the key began to form. Not in my hand. There was nothing to see or touch, but I felt its presence growing in the room, a shape carved out of sound and quiet, a skeleton key made to lock away the noise that had haunted me. When it was finished, I used it, a gesture of the mind, a turning of a lock that was not there, and the silence that fell was perfect, absolute. It was the quiet I had been starving for. It lasted for 72 hours. When the hammering returned, I understood the depth of my folly. I had been a pawn. The key had not been a lock for the noise. It had been a key for the thing that made it. My patient replication of its patterns had not been a defense. It had been a summoning. The hammering was different now. It had a weight that pressed on my soul. The sequences were a storm of intent, a symphony of a vast and patient hunger. The thing below had been waiting for a student, someone to complete the ritual, someone to forge the connection that would allow it to dream beyond the walls of its prison. I tried to leave. I packed my bags. I called for movers. But each time I stood at the door, the hammering would begin, urgent and sharp, a command laced with the promise of a terrible punishment for disobedience. During the day, I could almost pretend. The rational mind is a gifted storyteller. But at night, when the house remembered its true shape, I knew. The thing below was not just speaking to me anymore. It was teaching me again. New lessons, more complex forgings, keys for doors I could not see, but which I knew led to places where the silence was not empty, but ravenous. My notebook became my master. The handwriting on its pages no longer felt like my own. My work, my old life. It all seemed absurd now. A story about a man who lived in a world of simple, logical things. The hammering was a constant companion now. sometimes a gentle murmur, sometimes a furious demand, always teaching. And I, God help me, I was learning. The key had been the first lesson, a simple test of my aptitude. Now I was learning to make an arsenal of impossible tools. I was a student in a school I could not leave, with a teacher whose lessons grew deeper and darker with every passing day. The forge below was a classroom, and I was its first star pupil. The last lesson lasted 14 hours. The walls whispered with me, the windows hummed, the floor sang. When it was over, I found a new diagram in my notebook, the blueprint for something like a door or an invitation. Tonight, I am to forge it. The patterns are written, the timing is clear, and as I stand here, hammer in hand, notebook open, I have come to a final, quiet understanding. A piece of the lesson I had missed, the hammering, the teaching. It is not coming from the forge below. It is coming from the apartment above. Someone else is here. Someone who has been teaching me all along. The thing in the forge, it is not my teacher. It is my classmate, a student who has been here much, much longer. One who has already advanced to a level I cannot yet comprehend. The realization does not bring terror. It brings a strange, quiet peace. I am not alone in my studies. As I prepare for tonight's work, I hear footsteps in the apartment above me. A slow, measured rhythm. A rhythm I know so well. The true teacher has been here all along, patient and methodical, waiting for me to be ready for the truth. I raise my hammer. I am ready to begin. The footsteps above me shift into the familiar pattern. 3 short, 2 long, 1 sharp crack. Class is in session. Story 2. A story about a house that was waiting, and a smell that was a memory of a fire. The Hartwell property had been holding its breath on the market for 8 months when I first walked through its door. 8 months of falling prices, of inspections that whispered of problems unseen, of buyers who would step inside and then walk away, their faces pale, with no words to explain their sudden departure. The seller, Marcus Hartwell, he spoke of the house as a perfect thing. New paint, new fixtures, a clean and waiting shell. But a house does not linger like that, like a wounded animal in the woods, unless there is something deeply wrong with its heart. The smell found me before I had even said his name. Smoke. Not the gentle, woody scent of a hearth fire, but the smell of something that should never have burned. The scent of hot plastic and something like meat, something that had once been alive. It hung in the air of the narrow hall that connected the living room to the kitchen, a space so thin it felt like the house's windpipe. I stopped speaking. The polite words about square footage and natural light died in my throat. "Is everything all right?" Mr. Hartwell asked, but his eyes were shy. They would not meet mine. He was a thin, restless man, his hands always smoothing a collar that was not wrinkled, calming hair that was not out of place. I took out my phone, its little light a familiar comfort in the gloom of empty houses. The beam cut a path through the afternoon shadows, and that is when I saw them. On the walls, black patterns, like a script from a forgotten language, like the intricate knots of a sleeping serpent. They were not paint. They seemed to bloom from within the white surface itself, as if the wall had been scarred from the inside out. And in the steady light of my phone, the patterns seemed to breathe. A slow, dark pulse. The walls, I started to say, but Mr. Hartwell was already shaking his head. "White," he said, the word a sharp, quick thing. A fresh coat, Benjamin Moore, Swiss coffee. I blinked, and the walls were white. A perfect, clean, unbroken white. But the smell of the memory of a fire was still there. The ventilation, I murmured, a lie to soothe the moment. His laugh was like breaking glass. Serviced last week. Perfect working order. I spent the next hour walking through the house, my feet making soft sounds on the new floors. I was a ghost performing the motions of a life I was supposed to be selling. But every time I passed through that narrow hallway, the skin on my arms would tighten. The acrid smell would rise, and in the corner of my eye, I would see the black flowers blooming on the walls. When I turned to face them, there was only white. In my car, I sat for a long time. The autumn day had grown cool, and my breath was a cloud in the air. Realtors, we learn to feel the bones of a house. We know the ones with sad foundations, the ones whose walls have soaked up sorrow like rain. This was not that. This was something else. I took out my notebook, a soft leather book where I draw the shapes of rooms, and without a thought, my hand began to move. The pen flowed across the page, drawing curves and spirals that my mind did not know, but my hand remembered. A pattern bloomed in the ink, an intricate, beautiful knot that made my chest feel tight. That night, I dreamed of smoke. The next morning was full of other houses, other lives to sell. But my mind kept wandering back to the Hartwell house, to the patterns that were born and died in the corner of an eye. I called other agents, asked them quiet questions about strange smells and walls that remembered things. They had no stories for me. By evening, I was driving back. The house seemed smaller in the dying light, hunched against the coming dark. I parked across the street and watched its windows. My notebook was on the seat beside me, and I could feel a gentle warmth coming from it. I opened it to the page with the drawing. The ink was darker now, the lines sharper. As I watched, the pattern seemed to breathe, just as it had on the walls. A faint smell of smoke, the ghost of that wrong fire, began to fill my car. I dropped the book. I rolled down the window, gasping for the cool, clean air. When I looked again, it was just a drawing, but the smell was still with me. Over the next week, I brought 3 families to the Hartwell house. Each time, I held my breath as we neared the hallway. But the walls remained white. The air was clean. My client spoke of the lovely renovations, the good price. "Why hasn't this sold?" a young woman asked, her face bright with the hope of a first home. "It's waiting for the right people," I told her, and knew, as I said it, that she was not one of them. The house would turn its face away from her. That night, I called Mr. Hartwell. "The hallway," I said. "Have you ever noticed anything?" The silence on the line was a long, deep well. "You're the first," he said at last, the first one to say anything. "To say what?" "About the fire." The words were cold in my ear. "What fire?" "The one in 87, he said, his voice a dry whisper. "It started in the hallway. No one knows how. No wiring problems. No candles. The fire investigator said. He said it was like the fire started inside the walls themselves." I thought of the black flowers blooming from within. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it's over," he said too quickly. "It was repaired. It has nothing to do with anything." But I knew he was lying. After the call, I sat with my notebook. The pattern I had drawn now covered the whole page. It had grown. I touched the paper. It was warm, like skin. The smell of smoke bloomed in my kitchen. I closed the book and hid it in a drawer, but I could feel its presence, a small, secret fire smoldering in the dark. The next day, a professor of art history called, Margaret Chen. She wanted to see the house. "I'm interested in Islamic geometric art," she explained as we walked through the front door. I led her through the rooms, my voice a hollow thing. As we neared the hallway, I braced myself. Professor Chen stopped. She drew in her breath. "Oh," she whispered. "Extraordinary." I looked. The walls were a tapestry of black fire. The patterns were vast now, complex, flowing into one another like liquid shadow. The smell of smoke was a heavy weight in the air, and I could hear a soft, dry crackling. "You see them?" I asked, my voice trembling. She nodded, her phone already in her hand, taking pictures. "The craftsmanship is remarkable," she murmured. "These are ancient designs, but they seem to be burned into the wall, not painted." She stepped closer, her finger tracing one of the dark, flowing lines. The mathematics of it. It's like a map of eternity. The moment her skin touched the wall, the patterns began to move faster, to writhe. The smoke grew thick, and the crackling sound became a chorus of dry whispers. "We have to go," I said, and I took her arm. I pulled her away, pulled her from the house. Behind us, the air grew hot with a fire that had no flame. In the car, she looked at the photos on her phone. Her face was a mask of confusion. "That's strange," she said. "They're all just white walls." That night, I went back. The notebook on the seat beside me felt like a beating heart. The front door was unlocked. The hallway was waiting. My little light showed me that the patterns had grown again. They covered the floor, the ceiling, the walls. The entire corridor was a living, breathing thing made of black fire. I opened my notebook. The drawing had spread across many pages, the ink still blossoming. The whispers were clearer now, a language I did not know but could understand. They spoke of a fire that burns between the layers of the world, of walls that remember every moment they have witnessed. My hand began to move. I was copying the patterns from the walls, my pen a conduit for their strange, dark life. Each line I drew made the walls glow brighter. The smoke filled my lungs. I could not stop. Time became a river, and I floated in it. When I looked up, the dawn was a pale wound in the sky. The walls were white. My notebook was full. That was 3 weeks ago. I do not go back to the Hartwell house, but I see the sign still standing in the yard, leaning now, as if the earth itself is trying to push it away. The notebook lives in a drawer, but I feel it there. It calls to me in the quiet hours. Sometimes I think of what the professor said, a map of eternity. Sometimes I wonder if the fire from 1987 ever went out, or if it is still burning in the thin spaces between the seconds, in the walls of that quiet, waiting house. And sometimes, when the world is asleep, I think of opening the book. I think of studying the patterns until I understand their language, until I can see the fire that burns without a flame, until I know what the whispers want to tell me. The house is still for sale. But I do not think it is empty. I think it is full. And I think, sometimes, that a part of it is with me now. Story 3. It was Sarah who first spoke of the glass eyes. The suggestion bloomed in the quiet space between us. After 3 weeks, where sleep had become a shallow, gray water we could no longer sink into. A feeling had taken root in our home, a certainty that when the house fell silent, and the moon laid its silver cloth across the lawn, something else was awake out there. A corner of my mind, the part that still believed in well-lit rooms and solid ground, whispered of foraging animals, of a stray cat wandering through the shadows. But the cold stone that settled in my gut each night as dusk bled across the sky told a different story. And so, on a quiet Tuesday, I gave the darkness eyes. I fixed the first one under the shelter of the roof. A cold, black promise pointed at the yard. In my hands, it felt like a dense, polished worry. Through the kitchen window, I could see Sarah's reflection, a still life of a woman watching her husband prepare for a ghost, her coffee forgotten as it shed its warmth into the morning air. That night, the eyes showed us our own world, but sleeping. The infrared gaze painted it in shades of smoke and bone. There was the great oak, a grandmother's memory, given form in bark and leaf. There was the fence, a neat row of teeth separating our small patch of silence from the neighbors. And there was the garden, fallow and waiting, where we had meant to plant things 6 months ago. It was a landscape of peace, held in a silent, electronic breath. Then, the world began to dream. At the edge of the garden, the soil stirred. Not a violent upheaval, but a soft, hesitant swelling, as if a secret were pushing its way to the surface. It was a slow, patient gesture. Over minutes it grew, a gentle mound rising like a thought you can't quite place. The camera watched, clinical and calm, as trickles of earth slipped down its sides, the surface pulsing with a rhythm so organic it felt like watching a lung fill with air. It was a living thing made of our own backyard. We played the recording back, and then again, the silence in the room growing deeper with each viewing. Sarah's whisper finally cut through it, suggesting we go out, though the dawn was a cold, distant thought. My bare feet learned their mistake the moment they touched the lawn, the dew seeping through, my thin socks like a chill into bone. The mound was there, just as the eye had seen it, a soft, dark shape in the twilight, chest high and intimate, like a freshly turned grave for something small. I walked a slow circle around it, the beam of my flashlight a nervous finger tracing its form. The earth was loose, new, yet there was no wound in the ground beside it, no pit from which this much soil could have been borrowed. Sarah knew it first. She knelt, her hands sinking into the loose dirt, not with panic, but with a strange, focused calm, as if she were trying to solve a riddle written in soil. I found a small spade by the porch and joined her, the earth giving way, so easily, so softly. It felt less like digging, and more like being welcomed. 3 feet down, we found the nothing. Not the hard stop of rock or the dense pack of clay. It was a nothing that was a something. An emptiness that drank the beam of my flashlight. I reached my arm into that cool, dark throat, my shoulder pressed to the earth, my fingers searching for a bottom that was not there, and I felt it. A slow, rhythmic exhalation of cool air against my skin. The deep, steady breathing of a sleeping world. In the pale wash of the light, Sarah's face was a mask of porcelain fear. She wanted to fill it in, she whispered, to bury this discovery and let the morning forget it ever happened. But a feverish curiosity had already laid its hands on me. I had to know if this was a breath of nature or of something else. For the rest of that long, slow night, we watched from our window as the mound breathed. Its gentle rising and falling was a lullaby for something vast and ancient. Then, as the first hint of gray dawn touched the fence, It began to retreat. It did not fall apart. It sank, a slow, deliberate inhalation, the earth drawing its strange creation back into itself. When the sun was fully risen, there was nothing left but the smooth, undisturbed skin of the lawn. The second night, a new breath. This time it surfaced by the old oak tree. The same impossible birth from the soil. The same hollow heart. The same rhythmic pulse that, I began to notice, seemed to fall in step with my own if I listened too closely. I found myself matching my quiet inhalations to its deep, earthen ones. A shared secret that left a dizzying sense of lightness in my head, as if I were slowly becoming untethered from myself. By the fourth night, there were 7 graves without bodies, 7 breaths in the dark. Sarah no longer wanted to watch the recordings. She said the silent, pulsing images gave her headaches that bloomed behind her eyes. But I could not look away. I would sit in the blue glow of the monitor, searching for a pattern in the breathing, a language just on the edge of hearing. Then came the idea of the concrete, a hard, human answer to a soft, earthen question. Sarah saw it as a violation, a needless act of force. But the breathing of the yard had followed me into my sleep, and I needed to feel the solid weight of a solution in my hands. I bought the gray powder from a store full of bright lights and easy answers, and I mixed it in the wheelbarrow, a thick, heavy paste to choke the breathing. That night, the earth sighed near the back fence. The mound was larger this time, and its breath was deeper, a low, resonant whisper I could hear from our bed, like wind sighing through the bones of a buried cathedral. I waited until it had fully formed, its dark lungs at their peak, before carrying my bucket of liquid stone into the yard. The hole drank the concrete without a sound. It accepted the thick gray offering with a strange passivity, and I poured until the ground was level again, smoothing the surface with a trowel. The breathing stopped. A sudden, profound silence fell over the yard, as if I had pressed my hand over the mouth of the world. I felt a surge of pride, of control. It was a feeling that lasted only until morning. On the other side of the house, in a part of the yard that had always been still, a new mound had risen. It was larger, more ornate, and on its crest, nestled in the dark soil, were things that stole the air from my lungs. Sarah's college ring, which had vanished into the chaos of our move, gleamed with a faint, knowing light. Beside it, my father's reading glasses, the very ones he was wearing when his heart gave out 2 years ago. I'd kept them in a bedside drawer until they, too, had simply disappeared one day. From the tangled roots of the oak, Sarah found her grandmother's wedding dress, still folded in its brittle, yellowed paper, though the box in our closet where it lived had been empty for months. And near the front steps, buried just beneath the surface, I found my high school baseball glove. It smelled of leather oil in summer, a scent that had no right to exist after more than a decade of being lost to time. The earth was not just breathing. It was exhaling our past. It was returning to us the things we had mourned, the things we had forgotten, the things we had given up on. With every new mound came a fresh relic, and with every relic, a new question that etched itself into the quiet rooms of my mind. How did they travel through the solid ground? Where had they been waiting? And why now? Why for us? Sleep became a forgotten country. Every soft groan of the house was the earth shifting beneath us. Every settling floorboard, a sign that the breathing was coming inside. Sarah began to drift. Her showers grew longer. Her trips to the grocery store stretched into hours, though she always returned with almost nothing. Our words became careful. Little boats, navigating around the vast, silent thing we both knew was there, but refused to name. The breathing grew louder. What began as a rhythm you had to hold your own breath to hear became a constant, ambient hum, the sound of living beside a great, sleeping lung. I would find myself pausing, listening, my own breathing falling away until my chest burned for air, only to gasp and find myself perfectly in sync with the yard again. I no longer knew if I was following its rhythm or if it was following mine. Sarah started seeing them in the daylight. Small, fleeting mounds, she said, that would rise and fall in the instant between her glances out the kitchen window. I set up more cameras, but they saw only the mundane dance of birds and squirrels, of light and shadow on the grass. Her descriptions were so vivid, so fragile. I started to wonder if the eyes of the camera could no longer see the truth, or if the truth was now only for us to see. The gifts kept coming. Sarah's grandmother's china, piece by delicate piece, unearthed from different mounds like artifacts from a gentle shipwreck. My mother's jewelry, still resting in its velvet boxes, though she and they had been buried 5 years ago. The storybooks of my childhood, their pages clean, as if they had been sleeping in some deep, dry library beneath the soil. I am going outside. The earth is whispering my name. It sounds like Sarah's voice. It promises to show me where all the lost things go, before they are ready to come home. The cameras are still watching, their glass eyes still recording the impossible. But I no longer need to see. Some things are not meant to be observed. They are meant to be felt. Some truths can only be learned when you let the earth breathe you in. Story 4. It began not with a sound, but with the air itself. A sterile, chemical coolness that clung to the back of the throat, layered over something else, something older. A faint, organic sweetness, like flowers pressed too long in a heavy book. The ghost of life in a place that fought so hard to keep death at bay. Down the long, dreaming corridor, where the lights above trembled with a soft, inconsistent hum, was his grandfather's room. Before I reached the door, I could feel a sound more than hear it. A delicate crackle, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was the whisper of static, a sound that held within its breath the murmur of far-off sleeping voices. He was sitting up in the bed, a pale figure against the white sheets. His hands, worn and gentle like old leather, moved with a quiet reverence over the dial of a zenith radio. It was ancient, a vessel of dark, polished wood that seemed to drink the sterile light from the room. It hadn't been there the last time. Its finish was a clouded map of years, and the fabric over its speaker was the color of a faded memory. "Tommy," he breathed, his voice a new texture since the surgery, like rustling paper. He didn't look away from the radio. "You're just in time. The air is clearing." The static parted for a moment, like a curtain drawn aside, and from the space between, a woman's voice drifted. It was hollow and thin, a melody trapped in glass. The words themselves were lost, but the feeling of them, an urgent, quiet pleading, touched the skin on my arms and made it cool. Then the static, like a soft gray ocean, washed over her voice, and there was only that constant electrical sigh filling the corners of the room. Where did this come from? I drew the visitor's chair close, its legs whispering against the floor. The radio's faint amber glow painted soft, moving shadows on his face, making the overhead lights feel distant and cold, as if the small wooden box were drawing all the warmth to itself. "The storage room," he murmured, "down the hall, full of forgotten things." His fingers continued their slow, patient dance on the dial, each tiny movement a prayer for clarity in the chaos of sound. It keeps me company, better than the television noise the nurses leave on. I settled into the quiet, watching the ritual. It was hypnotic, the way his body would still when a voice, like a ghost of a word, would surface from the depths of the white noise. He would listen, his head tilted, before gently coaxing the dial to move on. The voices were always there, submerged, fragments of conversations that bloomed and dissolved like smoke in the air. Then, one bloomed into a perfect, chilling shape, a shard of ice in the warmth of the static. A woman's voice, as clear and close as a secret, whispered in my ear. "He's going to spill the water in 10 seconds. I leaned forward, a silent tremor moving through me. It was a mistake, a trick of the static in the mind. But before the thought could comfort me, my grandfather's hand, reaching for the plastic cup on his nightstand, gave a little shudder. The cup tipped in a slow, graceful arc. Water fell, splashing across the white landscape of the sheets, the sound on the floor like a soft, sudden rain. "Ah, damn it," he sighed, his fingers fumbling for the call button. "These hands?" The radio whispered on, but now I was leaning into its whisper, my whole body listening. The voices spoke in English, but from a great distance, as if from a room in another house, in another year. The static eroded most of their words, but then another phrase would rise, "Whole and perfect. The nurse will come in 3 minutes." I looked at my watch. The time was 3:47 p.m. The fragmented dialogue continued its soft, incoherent song, and I held my breath, waiting for a future that had been spoken aloud. At exactly 3:50 p.m., a soft knock fell on the door, and Nurse Patricia entered. Her shoes made no sound on the linoleum as she took in the spilled water, with a quiet, practiced sigh. "Let's get you dry, Mr. Hartwell." Her movements were a blur of clean efficiency. As she worked, the radio's static seemed to swell, to grow thicker, as if feeding on the quiet energy of her presence. After she left, a new kind of silence settled. I stared at the dark wood of the radio, a cold fascination blooming in my chest. "Grandpa, have you noticed anything strange about it?" He stopped turning the dial. His eyes, clouded by age and illness, found mine. They were filled with a light I hadn't seen in a long, long time. "You can hear them, can't you, Tommy?" The admission was a cold, gentle touch against my spine. I could only nod, afraid that a word would shatter the fragile, terrifying truth between us. "It started yesterday," he said, his hand drifting to his chest, to the place beneath the thin gown where the scar lay hidden. "They knew things," he whispered. "Things that were still sleeping, still waiting to happen." Over the next hour, I sat with him, a silent scribe to a quiet miracle. 5 more times, the voices spoke of the immediate future. They murmured of the dinner cart's arrival at 6:23 p.m., 2 minutes ahead of its usual rhythm. They spoke of a helicopter that would soon pass, and moments later, the deep, trembling thrum of its rotors filled the air outside the window. They whispered that the evening nurse would forget the water pitcher, and she did. her apology a soft echo of their prediction. Each prophecy was delivered and fulfilled with the quiet, unassuming precision of a ticking clock. As evening bled across the sky outside, the voices grew bolder. The spaces between the static shortened. I could distinguish them now. The woman, her voice like a silken thread, seemed to be the primary narrator. An older man, his voice like gravel and dust, would sometimes offer a technical-sounding comment. And a third, a presence more than a voice, whose words were always submerged, always just out of reach. "Tommy," Grandpa said, and his voice was so soft it was almost part of the static. "Turn it off." "What?" "The radio. I need you to turn it off." My hand reached for the power knob, but as my fingers brushed against the cool plastic, the woman's voice unspooled from the speaker, clearer than ever before. "He shouldn't do that. Not yet. He isn't ready." But a flicker of true fear was in my grandfather's eyes. He gave a sharp, urgent nod. I twisted the knob. The voices vanished. The room fell into a silence that was heavy and hollow, leaving only the distant, sleeping hum of the hospital around us. And that is when I heard her. Not from the radio, not from the room. The woman's voice bloomed inside my head, a thought that was not my own, whispering intimately into the delicate shell of my left ear. "The lights will flicker in 5 seconds." Beneath my breath, a countdown. 1, 2, 3, 4. On 5, the long fluorescent tubes above us hesitated. They dimmed, plunging the room into a momentary twilight, and then returned, humming their steady, indifferent song. "Oh, dear God," I breathed, my hand flying to my ear as if to catch a phantom sound. The voice was gone, but its echo remained, a faint, silvery ringing. Grandpa was watching me. On his face, an expression of deep, sorrowful understanding. "How long has it been for you, hearing them without the radio?" "That was the first time," I said. My own voice sounded alien, a recording played from far away. "How did you know?" "Because it has been happening to me since the morning," he said, his gaze unwavering. "The radio only makes them louder, but they are always there now, in my left ear, always telling me what comes next." He touched his chest again, over the hidden wound. "I think they did something to me in that operating room, Tommy. Something they didn't write in the charts." The woman's voice returned, a soft, invasive warmth inside my skull. "He's going to ask about the surgery in 30 seconds. I tried to shake my head, to dislodge the thought, but it clung there. As her silent countdown finished, a knock fell on the door. Dr. Reeves entered, his professional smile faltering as he saw the look on our faces. "How are we feeling tonight, Mr. Hartwell? Just wanted to check on that incision." As the doctor went about his gentle, practiced examination, the voices offered a silent, running commentary, just for me. They whispered each of his movements before he made them, spoke each of his questions a breath before he asked them. The precision of it was a quiet horror. We were all actors in a play, and only I could hear the script being read aloud. When the doctor left, I looked at the silent, dark radio. "It's not the radio, is it?" Grandpa shook his head, a slow, tired motion. "I don't think it ever was. I think it just helped us hear a song that was already playing." "But what is it?" My voice was a whisper. "A side effect? Did the surgery damage something?" "Or maybe," he said, his own voice sinking even lower, "it fixed something. Maybe it tuned us in to a broadcast that is always there. The thought of it settled over me, a soft, heavy blanket. If the voices were real, if the future was not a mystery but a script, what did that mean for us? Were our choices just illusions? Were we simply marionettes, dancing to a song that only we were cursed to hear? The woman's voice returned, and this time it was touched with something like sympathy. He is beginning to understand. The fear is a natural part of it. The questions. But he must learn that to fight it only makes the signal stronger. I pressed the palm of my hand to my left ear, a useless gesture. Her words were not sound. They were thought. His grandfather will ask him to stay the night in 45 minutes. He will say yes, even though a part of him wishes to run. He will lie in the dark and listen to us. And by the morning, he will know that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The certainty of her words was a terrible weight. I watched the clock on the wall, each tick a step closer to a decision I no longer owned. A profound dread coiled in my stomach, yet beneath it, a strange and terrible thirst was growing, an addiction to the knowledge. What would they tell me next? 45 minutes later, my grandfather's request came, the words a perfect echo of the prophecy. My own reply, "Yes, I'll stay," felt like a line spoken by another. The nurse brought a cot, a narrow bed for a night of troubled sleep. As the hospital settled into its nocturnal rhythm, the quiet breathing of a great machine, I lay in the darkness and listened. The voices grew stronger in the dark. They wove a tapestry of small, inevitable futures. Which patient's call light would blink on next, when the automated drips would begin their cycles. How many times the lonely security guard would pace the length of our corridor. But they also spoke of larger things, of threads that stretched out from this room, out from this hospital, into a vast, intricate web of events that connected everything. Sometime in that deep, hollow part of the night, as I drifted in the quiet space between waking and dreaming, the woman's voice came to me one last time. It was a final, gentle horror. He's beginning to see the pattern now. The surgery was just the first attunement. There are other frequencies, Tommy. So many others. And once you begin to truly hear us, you become part of the broadcast, too. I sat bolt upright in the darkness. My heart was a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. Across the room, my grandfather slept, his breathing even and deep. But the radio on his nightstand, dark and silent, seemed to pulse with a malevolent, sleeping energy. "What do you mean?" I whispered into the still, sterile air. But the voices were gone. They had said all they needed to say. There was only the antiseptic silence and the slow, creeping certainty that I was trapped, that somewhere in the static between one breath and the next, between what was and what would be, I had been retuned. And the most terrifying part, the part that settled in my soul like a fine, cold dust, was that I was no longer sure I wanted to find a way to turn it off. Story 5. The brass of the tap handles held a deeper chill tonight, a cold that seemed to seep from the metal and into the bones of my fingers. I was polishing the bar for the third time, a slow, circular motion in the deep quiet of the pub. After 10, a hush had fallen over Murphy's. Not the usual Friday night quiet, which is merely the absence of noise, but a heavier silence, a presence in itself. It was the kind of stillness that allows the world's secret sounds to surface. The low, electric hum from the beer coolers, like a sleeping breath. the far-off sigh of traffic, a distant river of sound, and the way the shadows gathered in the corners, pooling like dark water, refusing the command of the blazing overhead lights. I have been the keeper of this bar for 8 years. I know the liturgy of closing time by heart, a slow dance of stacking chairs, of washing floors, of counting coin, a meditation in motion. This ritual has always been my comfort, especially when the night felt long and frayed. But tonight was different. A strange thread was woven into the fabric of the routine, though I could not name its color or texture. Perhaps it was the emptiness, the lack of the familiar faces that should have been here. Or perhaps it was the hollow space at the far end of the bar, the stool where Eddie Carmichael's ghost now sat. For 20 years, Eddie had made a pilgrimage to this stool every Friday. He would ask for a Guinness, always on tap, with extra foam in a glass that had been chilled until it wept. He would hold that dark pint for precisely 47 minutes. I know, because I once watched the clock, mesmerized by his strange devotion. And then he would leave a $5 bill, a silent offering, before walking the 6 blocks to his quiet apartment. But last Friday, the stool remained empty. A rumor, soft as a prayer, had drifted through the neighborhood. He had passed in his sleep, found by his landlord when the rent, for the first time in memory, was late. I tried to push the thought of Eddie away as I moved through my familiar dance, but his absence was a physical weight. The Guinness tap at the far right of the beer system seemed to watch me, its black handle a solemn, gleaming finger, pointing toward the void he had left. And then, at 7 minutes to 1, a time when the world holds its breath, the first drops appeared. I saw them as I was counting the last of the day's earnings, small, dark blossoms spreading on the clean, white towel I had laid beneath the taps. At first, I thought nothing of it. Condensation, perhaps. The lines run cold, and the September air was thick with humidity. But when I leaned closer, I saw that the liquid was wrong. It was too dark, too viscous. It moved with the slow, patient crawl of oil, leaving stains that did not fade into the cloth, but sat upon it, dark and definite. A shiver, like a memory of cold, traced its way down my spine. I followed the stain to its source, the Guinness tap. It was weeping black tears. I took a rag and wiped the spout clean, a simple, logical act. I expected to find a loose part, a failing seal. The metal felt as it always did, cool and solid. But the moment I drew my hand away, another drop began to form at the lip of the spout. It swelled there, a perfect dark pearl, before letting go and falling with a soft, audible thud onto the waiting towel. My hands began to tremble. I reached behind the bar for the CO, 2-valve, the heart of the pressure system. To turn it off was to cut the breath from the taps. Nothing could flow. The valve turned with a gentle sigh, the familiar hiss of pressure bleeding from the lines. I waited, my eyes fixed on the Guinness tap, and I watched another drop swell, and then another. It was not possible. Without the push of the gas, the taps were just hollow, metal mouths connected to silent kegs in the earth below. There was no force, no gravity that could draw the liquid up. And yet, it wept. Thick, dark tears that bled like a wound that would not heal. My hand found my phone. I began to dial the number for Sean Murphy, the owner. I stopped. What could the words be? The tap is crying? Physics has taken a holiday in your bar? I knew Sean. He had little patience for poetry when it came to his equipment. The soft, rhythmic fall of the drops filled the empty room. Plop, plop, plop. Each one louder than the one before, echoing in the silence like a clock, counting down. I tried to weave a net of logic around the thing. Residual pressure, a faulty valve, the strange dance of temperature and air. There had to be an answer made of words I knew. I decided to follow the line to its beginning. The basement stairs groaned under my feet as I went down, each step a complaint in the deep, close air. The storage room held the scent of old beer and damp stone, but beneath it was something else, a note that was organic and faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in their water. It made my stomach tighten. I pulled the string for the bare bulb that hung from the ceiling. It cast long, dancing shadows that turned the steel kegs into silent, waiting figures. The Guinness keg was at the very end, a brushed aluminum cylinder connected to a web of clear tubing. I traced the line from the keg to the ceiling, where it vanished on its journey to the bar 20 feet above. It all looked as it should. The connections were sound. The gauges read 0. The system was asleep. But the keg was humming. It was a delicate vibration at first. A tremor you felt more in your bones than in your skin. I laid my hand flat against its cool metal side. The vibration grew stronger, a steady, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to rise from the very heart of the container. It was not the shudder of a machine. It felt alive. It felt like a heartbeat. I pulled my hand back as if burned. I stumbled away, my heel catching a crate of empty bottles. The sound of shattering glass was a gunshot in the tomb-like quiet of the basement, and in the ringing silence that followed, I heard it. A sound that turned the blood in my veins to ice. The unmistakable sound of liquid flowing through the line above my head. Not dripping, flowing. I took the stairs, 2, 3 at a time, my own heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The sight that waited for me was a quiet violation of all known laws. The Guinness tap was no longer weeping. It was bleeding. A steady, silent stream of that thick, black fluid poured from the spout. It had the viscous, light-swallowing quality of crude oil. It coated the tap, the handle, and spilled onto the bar in dark, slow-motion rivulets, staining the wood like ink. Then came the smell, metallic, like old pennies, and organic, the scent of deep earth and decay. It rose from the flow, a phantom of the grave. This was not beer. This was something that had once been beer, but had been changed, transformed into something else. Something that belonged in the earth, not in a glass. I threw myself at the tap handle, trying to force it, to close what was already closed. The handle was firm in its off position. The flow continued, indifferent, as if the mechanics of the thing were merely a polite suggestion. A foam began to build at the base of the tap. It was not a foam I recognized. It grew like a strange, dark blossom, a crown of shadow spreading across the bar. Panic, cold and sharp, sank its teeth into me. I grabbed fistfuls of towels, trying to build a dam, to contain the impossible tide. But the liquid seemed to move with a mind of its own, repelling the cloth, seeking the edges of the bar. It dripped to the floor in heavy, fat drops, a sound like a slow, mad drum. That is when I heard his voice. It came from everywhere at once, and from a place deep inside my own skull. A whisper that bloomed in the air. Friday night special. Extra foam. Don't forget the toast. The words were Eddie's, the same gravel in the tone, softened by a lifetime of unfiltered cigarettes. the same faint hint of Boston that curled around his vowels. But Eddie was gone. He was quiet dust in an urn. He was a memory buried under the soil. He could not be here, whispering of a beer that had become a waking nightmare. You always remembered, the voice continued, a soft sigh of sound. I spun, searching the empty corners of the pub, my eyes finding nothing but shadow. Friday nights, same stool, same order, same tip. The flow from the tap swelled and I watched, frozen, as the dark liquid began to churn and foam. But this was not the gentle, creamy head of a proper Guinness. This was a foam as black as a sealed room, expanding, growing, and carrying with it that sickeningly sweet smell of wet soil and copper. I retreated from the bar, my mind a scrambling thing, trying to find a foothold in reason. A hallucination, a psychotic break born of stress, carbon monoxide leaking from a faulty pipe. Anything but the truth that was now flowing across my bar. The truth that, somehow, impossibly, Eddie Carmichael was still ordering his Friday night pint. The toast, the whisper came again, seeming to rise from the growing black foam. You never forget the toast? And I remembered. Eddie never simply drank his beer. He would raise the glass, a silent salute, to his wife, Margaret, long since passed, to a baseball team's victory, to the simple survival of another week. It was his ritual, as constant as his 47-minute vigil. The foam kept expanding, spilling from the bar and onto the floor, where it pooled in a way that defied the very nature of liquid. It did not spread, it crept. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose toward the empty stool, Eddie's stool. The smell deepened, the scent of flowers decaying in their vase, sweet and cloying. My hands were shaking, but they moved as if guided by another will. I reached for a clean pint glass from the rack. A part of my mind was screaming, "This is madness. You are feeding a delusion." But a deeper, more ancient part of my brain, the part that knows the truth of the darkness under the bed, recognized that I was a participant in something now, and that resistance was a foolish thought. The glass felt impossibly heavy as I held it under the ceaseless, silent flow. The dark liquid filled it with a soft whispering sound, coating the inside with an oily film that caught the light like a slick of petroleum. The smell was a presence now, a thick cloud that made my eyes water. When the glass was full, I lifted it. My hands trembled. The liquid within barely moved. It was thicker than it looked, and as I stared into its black, opaque depths, I thought I could see things stirring, formless shapes, shadows moving in a midnight sea. "To Eddie Carmichael?" I whispered. My own voice sounded alien, a faint tremor in the air. The moment the words were spoken, the flow from the tap ceased. It stopped so suddenly, so completely, it was as if it had never been. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, a deafening pressure in my ears. The foam, too, stopped its advance, frozen in place like a still photograph of a nightmare. I stood there for a long time, holding the glass of impossible liquid, my mind trying to rebuild its world. All my logical explanations had turned to dust. This was not a broken machine. This was not a broken mind. This was something that listened, something that answered to a name, something that required a sacrament for the dead. The glass grew heavier still, and I understood. I was expected to drink. The thought was a wave of revulsion, but the whisper came again, closer this time, as if his lips were beside my ear. Friday night special. same as always. I brought the glass to my mouth. The metallic sweetness was overpowering. The liquid was room temperature. Warm like blood. Thick like syrup. As it touched my tongue, a universe of flavor bloomed across my senses. Copper, dark earth, and a strange organic sweetness. It was not unpleasant, and that was the most disturbing thing of all. I swallowed. A warmth spread from my throat down into my chest, a living heat that felt curious. I could feel it moving through me, as if it were exploring this new vessel, taking inventory. And the pub around me began to dissolve. The harsh lights softened and bled into the warm yellow glow of old-fashioned bulbs. The silence was filled with the ghosts of sound, dozens of conversations murmuring just beneath the skin of hearing. The air grew heavy with the phantom scent of cigarette smoke, a smell that had not been real in this room for years. In the edges of my vision, shapes moved, vanishing when I tried to look at them. Eddie's stool was no longer empty. He was there, a man in his late 60s, with hands that knew work and hair the color of steel. He was just as I remembered him, in his faded flannel shirt, the small, white scar, a crescent moon above his left eyebrow. The only difference was his eyes. They held a depth that was not of this world, a quiet, ancient seeing. He raised his own glass of perfect dark Guinness in a gesture I knew as well as my own heartbeat. I found myself lifting my own in return. The black liquid in my glass shifted slowly, as if reluctant to move. "Friday night special," Eddie said, and his voice held all the weight of every Friday that had ever been. Same as always. We drank together in a place that was Murphy's and yet not, surrounded by the whispers of the long departed. The liquid slid down my throat like warm oil, and with it came the taste of memory and loss. Each swallow was different. The salt of tears, the sharp tang of old blood, the sweet decay of funeral flowers. When the glass was empty, the warmth in my stomach had become a quiet fire that filled my entire body. I felt connected, woven into a tapestry of remembrance that stretched back through all of Eddie's lonely nights in this pub. I could feel his memories as if they were my own. The sound of Margaret's laugh, the weight of her hand in his, the vast, echoing silence of an empty apartment. "Time to go," Eddie said. He stood from his stool with the same careful grace I remembered. "See you next Friday." He walked toward the door, and with each step, his form became less solid, more like smoke, until he was nothing but a memory dissolving into the air. And as he faded, the pub faded with him. The warm light grew hard and white again. The ghostly voices fell silent. The phantom smoke cleared. I was alone again, behind the bar, holding an empty glass. There was nothing in it but a faint, oily residue. The Guinness tap was silent, pristine. The towels I had thrown on the floor were merely damp now, stained with the faint brown of ordinary spilled beer. My hands shook as I set the glass down. Everything was normal. And yet, the taste lingered on my tongue, metallic and warm. I could still feel that living heat inside me, a slow, pulsing current. I finished my duties in a dream, my hands performing the familiar tasks, while my mind drifted in the strange waters of what had happened. Was it real? Or had I simply served a pint to my own grief? The evidence was gone, all of it. But as I locked the heavy door and stepped out into the cool September night, I felt a gaze on my back from the dark windows of Murphy's. And in my pocket, My phone gave a soft buzz. A message from an unknown number. Same time next week. Don't forget the phone. I deleted it without a second glance, but the words were already burned into me. Next Friday. It felt a lifetime away and terrifyingly near. A part of me wanted to run, to leave the keys on the bar and never return. But a larger part of me, the part that now tasted of copper and earth, the part that held a strange living warmth, knew I would be back. Some rituals, once you have taken part, demand you continue. Some debts, once you have acknowledged them, must be paid. And on some Friday nights, in the deep, quiet hours, the dead are thirsty, and they need their beer, served with extra foam and a toast to what is remembered. The walk home took longer. My feet felt heavy. The taste in my mouth was changing, growing more complex. Under the metallic warmth, other notes were emerging. The faint sweetness of yeast and hops, the quiet satisfaction of a shared drink, the bittersweet peace of a tradition that has outlived its creator. By the time I reached my own front door, I understood. What had happened in the bar was not entirely of the spirit world, and not entirely of the mind. It lived in the space between, the place where memory becomes as real as stone. Eddie Carmichael was gone, but his Friday nights were not. They lived on, held in place by the simple act of pouring a beer. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, and I knew. Next Friday, I would be there. And when the clock struck 7 minutes to 1, I would be ready. With a clean, chilled glass, and the words that were needed. A toast, an acknowledgement, a bridge across the quiet water. The warmth in my stomach pulsed just once, a slow, deep beat, and then settled into a rhythm that matched my own. I was no longer just a bartender. I was a keeper of the quiet hours, a guardian of a ritual that outlasted death. And somewhere in the darkness behind me, far away, I was sure I could hear the soft, gentle sound of a beer tap opening, ready to serve one more round to the ghosts who knew how to ask. A story about a house that was waiting, and a smell that was a memory of a fire. The Hartwell property had been holding its breath on the market for 8 months when I first walked through its door. 8 months of falling prices, of inspections that whispered of problems unseen, of buyers who would step inside and then walk away, their faces pale, with no words to explain their sudden departure. The seller, Marcus Hartwell, he spoke of the house as a perfect thing. New paint, new fixtures, a clean and waiting shell. But a house does not linger like that, like a wounded animal in the woods, unless there is something deeply wrong with its heart. The smell found me before I had even said his name. Smoke. Not the gentle, woody scent of a hearth fire, but the smell of something that should never have burned. The scent of hot plastic and something like meat, something that had once been alive. It hung in the air of the narrow hall that connected the living room to the kitchen, a space so thin it felt like the house's windpipe. I stopped speaking. The polite words about square footage and natural light died in my throat. "Is everything all right?" Mr. Hartwell asked, but his eyes were shy. They would not meet mine. He was a thin, restless man, his hands always smoothing a collar that was not wrinkled, calming hair that was not out of place. I took out my phone, its little light a familiar comfort in the gloom of empty houses. The beam cut a path through the afternoon shadows, and that is when I saw them. On the walls, black patterns, like a script from a forgotten language, like the intricate knots of a sleeping serpent. They were not paint. They seemed to bloom from within the white surface itself, as if the wall had been scarred from the inside out. And in the steady light of my phone, the patterns seemed to breathe. A slow, dark pulse. The walls, I started to say, but Mr. Hartwell was already shaking his head. White, he said, the word a sharp, quick thing. A fresh coat. Benjamin Moore, Swiss coffee. I blinked, and the walls were white. A perfect, clean, unbroken white. But the smell of the memory of a fire was still there. The ventilation, I murmured, a lie to soothe the moment. His laugh was like breaking glass. Serviced last week. Perfect working order. I spent the next hour walking through the house, my feet making soft sounds on the new floors. I was a ghost performing the motions of a life I was supposed to be selling. But every time I passed through that narrow hallway, the skin on my arms would tighten. The acrid smell would rise, and in the corner of my eye, I would see the black flowers blooming on the walls. When I turned to face them, there was only white. In my car, I sat for a long time. The autumn day had grown cool, and my breath was a cloud in the air. Realtors, we learn to feel the bones of a house. We know the ones with sad foundations, the ones whose walls have soaked up sorrow like rain. This was not that. This was something else. I took out my notebook, a soft leather book where I draw the shapes of rooms, and without a thought, my hand began to move. The pen flowed across the page, drawing curves and spirals that my mind did not know, but my hand remembered. A pattern bloomed in the ink, an intricate, beautiful knot that made my chest feel tight. That night, I dreamed of smoke. The next morning was full of other houses, other lives to sell. But my mind kept wandering back to the Hartwell house, to the patterns that were born and died in the corner of an eye. I called other agents, asked them quiet questions about strange smells and walls that remembered things. They had no stories for me. By evening, I was driving back. The house seemed smaller in the dying light, hunched against the coming dark. I parked across the street and watched its windows. My notebook was on the seat beside me, and I could feel a gentle warmth coming from it. I opened it to the page with the drawing. The ink was darker now, the lines sharper. As I watched, the pattern seemed to breathe, just as it had on the walls. A faint smell of smoke, the ghost of that wrong fire, began to fill my car. I dropped the book. I rolled down the window, gasping for the cool, clean air. When I looked again, it was just a drawing, but the smell was still with me. Over the next week, I brought 3 families to the Hartwell house. Each time, I held my breath as we neared the hallway. But the walls remained white. The air was clean. My clients spoke of the lovely renovations, the good price. "Why hasn't this sold?" a young woman asked, her face bright with the hope of a first home. "It's waiting for the right people," I told her, and knew, as I said it, that she was not one of them. The house would turn its face away from her. That night, I called Mr. Hartwell. "The hallway," I said. "Have you ever noticed anything?" The silence on the line was a long, deep well. "You're the first," he said at last, the first one to say anything. "To say what?" "About the fire." The words were cold in my ear. "What fire?" "The one in 87, he said, his voice a dry whisper. "It started in the hallway. No one knows how. No wiring problems. No candles. The fire investigator said. He said it was like the fire started inside the walls themselves. I thought of the black flowers blooming from within. Why didn't you tell me? Because it's over, he said too quickly. It was repaired. It has nothing to do with anything. But I knew he was lying. After the call, I sat with my notebook. The pattern I had drawn now covered the whole page. It had grown. I touched the paper. It was warm, like skin. The smell of smoke bloomed in my kitchen. I closed the book and hid it in a drawer, but I could feel its presence, a small, secret fire smoldering in the dark. The next day, a professor of art history called, Margaret Chen. She wanted to see the house. I'm interested in Islamic geometric art, she explained as we walked through the front door. I led her through the rooms, my voice a hollow thing. As we neared the hallway, I braced myself. Professor Chen stopped. She drew in her breath. Oh, she whispered. Extraordinary. I looked. The walls were a tapestry of black fire. The patterns were vast now, complex, flowing into one another like liquid shadow. The smell of smoke was a heavy weight in the air, and I could hear a soft, dry crackling. You see them? I asked, my voice trembling. She nodded, her phone already in her hand, taking pictures. The craftsmanship is remarkable, she murmured. These are ancient designs, but they seem to be burned into the wall, not painted. She stepped closer, her finger tracing one of the dark, flowing lines. The mathematics of it. It's like a map of eternity. The moment her skin touched the wall, the patterns began to move faster, to writhe. The smoke grew thick, and the crackling sound became a chorus of dry whispers. We have to go, I said, and I took her arm. I pulled her away, pulled her from the house. Behind us, the air grew hot with a fire that had no flame. In the car, she looked at the photos on her phone. Her face was a mask of confusion. That's strange, she said. They're all just white walls. That night, I went back. The notebook on the seat beside me felt like a beating heart. The front door was unlocked. The hallway was waiting. My little light showed me that the patterns had grown again. They covered the floor, the ceiling, the walls. The entire corridor was a living, breathing thing made of black fire. I opened my notebook. The drawing had spread across many pages, the ink still blossoming. The whispers were clearer now, a language I did not know but could understand. They spoke of a fire that burns between the layers of the world, of walls that remember every moment they have witnessed. My hand began to move. I was copying the patterns from the walls, my pen a conduit for their strange, dark life. Each line I drew made the walls glow brighter. The smoke filled my lungs. I could not stop. Time became a river, and I floated in it. When I looked up, the dawn was a pale wound in the sky. The walls were white. My notebook was full. That was 3 weeks ago. I do not go back to the Hartwell house, but I see the sign still standing in the yard, leaning now, as if the earth itself is trying to push it away. The notebook lives in a drawer, but I feel it there. It calls to me in the quiet hours. Sometimes I think of what the professor said, a map of eternity. Sometimes I wonder if the fire from 1987 ever went out, or if it is still burning in the thin spaces between the seconds, in the walls of that quiet, waiting house. And sometimes, when the world is asleep, I think of opening the book. I think of studying the patterns until I understand their language, until I can see the fire that burns without a flame, until I know what the whispers want to tell me. The house is still for sale. But I do not think it is empty. I think it is full. And I think, sometimes, that a part of it is with me now. It began not with a sound, but with the air itself, a sterile, chemical coolness that clung to the back of the throat, layered over something else, something older, a faint, organic sweetness, like flowers pressed too long in a heavy book, the ghost of life in a place that fought so hard to keep death at bay. Down the long, dreaming corridor, where the lights above trembled with a soft, inconsistent hum, was his grandfather's room. Before I reached the door, I could feel a sound more than hear it. A delicate crackle, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was the whisper of static, a sound that held within its breath the murmur of far-off sleeping voices. He was sitting up in the bed, a pale figure against the white sheets. His hands, worn and gentle like old leather, moved with a quiet reverence over the dial of a zenith radio. It was ancient, a vessel of dark, polished wood that seemed to drink the sterile light from the room. It hadn't been there the last time. Its finish was a clouded map of years, and the fabric over its speaker was the color of a faded memory. "Tommy," he breathed, his voice a new texture since the surgery, like rustling paper. He didn't look away from the radio. "You're just in time. The air is clearing." The static parted for a moment, like a curtain drawn aside, and from the space between, a woman's voice drifted. It was hollow and thin, a melody trapped in glass. The words themselves were lost, but the feeling of them, an urgent, quiet pleading, touched the skin on my arms and made it cool. Then the static, like a soft gray ocean, washed over her voice, and there was only that constant electrical sigh filling the corners of the room. Where did this come from? I drew the visitor's chair close, its legs whispering against the floor. The radio's faint amber glow painted soft, moving shadows on his face, making the overhead lights feel distant and cold, as if the small wooden box were drawing all the warmth to itself. "The storage room," he murmured, "down the hall, full of forgotten things." His fingers continued their slow, patient dance on the dial, each tiny movement a prayer for clarity in the chaos of sound. It keeps me company, better than the television noise the nurses leave on. I settled into the quiet, watching the ritual. It was hypnotic, the way his body would still when a voice, like a ghost of a word, would surface from the depths of the white noise. He would listen, his head tilted, before gently coaxing the dial to move on. The voices were always there, submerged, fragments of conversations that bloomed and dissolved like smoke in the air. Then, one bloomed into a perfect, chilling shape, a shard of ice in the warmth of the static. A woman's voice, as clear and close as a secret, whispered in my ear. "He's going to spill the water in 10 seconds. I leaned forward, a silent tremor moving through me. It was a mistake, a trick of the static in the mind. But before the thought could comfort me, my grandfather's hand, reaching for the plastic cup on his nightstand, gave a little shudder. The cup tipped in a slow, graceful arc. Water fell, splashing across the white landscape of the sheets, the sound on the floor like a soft, sudden rain. "Ah, damn it," he sighed, his fingers fumbling for the call button. "These hands?" The radio whispered on, but now I was leaning into its whisper, my whole body listening. The voices spoke in English, but from a great distance, as if from a room in another house, in another year. The static eroded most of their words, but then another phrase would rise. Whole and perfect. The nurse will come in 3 minutes. I looked at my watch. The time was 3:47 p.m. The fragmented dialogue continued its soft, incoherent song, and I held my breath, waiting for a future that had been spoken aloud. At exactly 3:50 p.m., a soft knock fell on the door, and Nurse Patricia entered. Her shoes made no sound on the linoleum as she took in the spilled water, with a quiet, practiced sigh. "Let's get you dry, Mr. Hartwell." Her movements were a blur of clean efficiency. As she worked, the radio's static seemed to swell, to grow thicker, as if feeding on the quiet energy of her presence. After she left, a new kind of silence settled. I stared at the dark wood of the radio, a cold fascination blooming in my chest. "Grandpa, have you noticed anything strange about it?" He stopped turning the dial. His eyes, clouded by age and illness, found mine. They were filled with a light I hadn't seen in a long, long time. "You can hear them, can't you, Tommy?" The admission was a cold, gentle touch against my spine. I could only nod, afraid that a word would shatter the fragile, terrifying truth between us. "It started yesterday," he said, his hand drifting to his chest, to the place beneath the thin gown where the scar lay hidden. "They knew things," he whispered. "Things that were still sleeping, still waiting to happen." Over the next hour, I sat with him, a silent scribe to a quiet miracle. 5 more times, the voices spoke of the immediate future. They murmured of the dinner cart's arrival at 6:23 p.m., 2 minutes ahead of its usual rhythm. They spoke of a helicopter that would soon pass, and moments later, the deep, trembling thrum of its rotors filled the air outside the window. They whispered that the evening nurse would forget the water pitcher, and she did, her apology a soft echo of their prediction. Each prophecy was delivered and fulfilled with the quiet, unassuming precision of a ticking clock. As evening bled across the sky outside, the voices grew bolder. The spaces between the static shortened. I could distinguish them now. The woman, her voice like a silken thread, seemed to be the primary narrator. An older man, his voice like gravel and dust, would sometimes offer a technical-sounding comment. And a third, a presence more than a voice, whose words were always submerged, always just out of reach. "Tommy," Grandpa said, and his voice was so soft it was almost part of the static. "Turn it off." "What?" "The radio. I need you to turn it off." My hand reached for the power knob, but as my fingers brushed against the cool plastic, the woman's voice unspooled from the speaker, clearer than ever before. "He shouldn't do that. Not yet. He isn't ready." But a flicker of true fear was in my grandfather's eyes. He gave a sharp, urgent nod. I twisted the knob. The voices vanished. The room fell into a silence that was heavy and hollow, leaving only the distant, sleeping hum of the hospital around us. And that is when I heard her. Not from the radio, not from the room. The woman's voice bloomed inside my head, a thought that was not my own, whispering intimately into the delicate shell of my left ear. "The lights will flicker in 5 seconds." Beneath my breath, a countdown. 1, 2, 3, 4. On 5, the long fluorescent tubes above us hesitated. They dimmed, plunging the room into a momentary twilight, and then returned, humming their steady, indifferent song. "Oh, dear God," I breathed, my hand flying to my ear as if to catch a phantom sound. The voice was gone, but its echo remained, a faint, silvery ringing. Grandpa was watching me. On his face, an expression of deep, sorrowful understanding. How long has it been for you? Hearing them without the radio. That was the first time, I said. My own voice sounded alien, a recording played from far away. How did you know? Because it has been happening to me since the morning, he said, his gaze unwavering. The radio only makes them louder, but they are always there now, in my left ear, always telling me what comes next. He touched his chest again, over the hidden wound. I think they did something to me in that operating room, Tommy. Something they didn't write in the charts. The woman's voice returned, a soft, invasive warmth inside my skull. He's going to ask about the surgery in 30 seconds. I tried to shake my head, to dislodge the thought, but it clung there. As her silent countdown finished, a knock fell on the door. Dr. Reeves entered, his professional smile faltering as he saw the look on our faces. How are we feeling tonight, Mr. Hartwell? Just wanted to check on that incision. As the doctor went about his gentle, practiced examination, the voices offered a silent, running commentary, just for me. They whispered each of his movements before he made them, spoke each of his questions a breath before he asked them. The precision of it was a quiet horror. We were all actors in a play, and only I could hear the script being read aloud. When the doctor left, I looked at the silent, dark radio. It's not the radio, is it? Grandpa shook his head, a slow, tired motion. I don't think it ever was. I think it just helped us hear a song that was already playing. But what is it? My voice was a whisper. A side effect? Did the surgery damage something? Or maybe, he said, his own voice sinking even lower, it fixed something. Maybe it tuned us in to a broadcast that is always there. The thought of it settled over me, a soft, heavy blanket. If the voices were real, if the future was not a mystery but a script, what did that mean for us? Were our choices just illusions? Were we simply marionettes, dancing to a song that only we were cursed to hear? The woman's voice returned, and this time it was touched with something like sympathy. He is beginning to understand. The fear is a natural part of it. The questions. But he must learn that to fight it only makes the signal stronger. I pressed the palm of my hand to my left ear, a useless gesture. Her words were not sound. They were thought. His grandfather will ask him to stay the night in 45 minutes. He will say yes, even though a part of him wishes to run. He will lie in the dark and listen to us. And by the morning, he will know that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The certainty of her words was a terrible weight. I watched the clock on the wall, each tick a step closer to a decision I no longer owned. A profound dread coiled in my stomach, yet beneath it, a strange and terrible thirst was growing, an addiction to the knowledge. What would they tell me next? 45 minutes later, my grandfather's request came, the words, a perfect echo of the prophecy. My own reply, yes, I'll stay, felt like a line spoken by another. The nurse brought a cot, a narrow bed for a night of troubled sleep. As the hospital settled into its nocturnal rhythm, the quiet breathing of a great machine, I lay in the darkness and listened. The voices grew stronger in the dark. They wove a tapestry of small, inevitable futures. Which patient's call light would blink on next, when the automated drips would begin their cycles. how many times the lonely security guard would pace the length of our corridor. But they also spoke of larger things, of threads that stretched out from this room, out from this hospital, into a vast, intricate web of events that connected everything. Sometime in that deep, hollow part of the night, as I drifted in the quiet space between waking and dreaming, the woman's voice came to me one last time. It was a final, gentle horror. He's beginning to see the pattern now. The surgery was just the first attunement. There are other frequencies, Tommy. So many others. And once you begin to truly hear us, you become part of the broadcast, too. I sat bolt upright in the darkness. My heart was a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. Across the room, my grandfather slept, his breathing even and deep. But the radio on his nightstand, dark and silent, seemed to pulse with a malevolent, sleeping energy. "What do you mean?" I whispered into the still, sterile air. But the voices were gone. They had said all they needed to say. There was only the antiseptic silence and the slow, creeping certainty that I was trapped, that somewhere in the static between one breath and the next, between what was and what would be, I had been retuned. And the most terrifying part, the part that settled in my soul like a fine, cold dust, was that I was no longer sure I wanted to find a way to turn it off. perfectly paired with soothing